we're going to take a sort of conceptual and categorical leap here. I assume you all have some familiarity with the I Ching. Is that a reasonable assumption? The I Ching is a Chinese divinatory system of great antiquity. It involves 64 ideograms called hexagrams that are composed of broken and unbroken lines. They are arranged in a traditional sequence called the King Wen sequence. The divination is carried out through a coin toss operation or a sortilege involving Eurostocks. I assume I'm not making headlines with this news for anybody, okay? Good. So, the I Ching, usually translated as the Book of Changes, is in fact a scientific text, in my opinion, a study of great sophistication of the very subject we're talking about this evening, the nature of time, the nature of change. And in the same way that Western science, by fixating through certain Greek predilections on matter, was able to unravel a nuclear chemistry and molecular biology and so forth, these ancient people in China, pre-Han, early Zhou, which we're talking 1500 BC, they weren't interested in matter. They were interested in time. And they brought to this interest in time at least as much energy and sophistication as the research teams at CERN in Switzerland bring to probing the heart of the nucleus of the atom. And they learned things. You know, you spend a millennium or two on a given problem, posing that problem under all circumstances and from many philosophical points of view and pharmacological platforms. Eventually, you begin to get answers. And I believe that the I Ching is a kind of smashed up piece of machinery that in its present form is but a shadow of what it represented in the past in terms of sophistication and understanding. For several thousand years, it has been commented on and passed down and preserved by people who were not fully in touch with precisely what it was. You know, under the guidance of the Logos, with the help of psilocybin and so forth and so on, I think I've made some progress with reconstructing what this ancient piece of machinery might have looked like and what kind of information they might have been getting out of it. So now bear with me for a minute, if you haven't been already. As I said, the I Ching is 64 hexagrams, numbered 1 through 64, and usually presented in a traditional sequence called the King Wen sequence, which is old. Nobody knows where it came from. King Wen is a legendary figure. He supposedly got into some political trouble around 1350 BC, and they put him in the can for a while. And while he was there, he figured this out. He thought it up. He built this operating system. And the interesting thing about the King Wen sequence is that it is not in a logical sequence on the face of it. When Leibniz, the European philosopher, got his hands on the I Ching, his Jesuit friends shipped him a copy in the 17th century, he immediately organized it as a binary number system. And rearranged the hexagram and showed that it was a binary number system. And Leibniz's sequence, any hacker knows instantly how to do it from the first hexagram on. King Wen's sequence is not at all obviously under any set of rules. And the Logos, in its promptings to me, it was interesting. It was like a koan. You know, a problem which a master sets a student, which must be solved before we can move on to deeper water. And the koan was, you know, what are the ordering principles of the King Wen sequence? Can you prove, in fact, that it is the product of intent? Or is it, in fact, simply a jumble that has become traditional over thousands of years, and there is no set of rules for generating the King Wen sequence? Pretty close focus stuff, you notice. We're not talking here about planetary transformation or human fusion with the biosphere. It's very academic, close focus, analytical stuff. So I looked at the King Wen sequence, and I was intuitively led, is probably the way to put it, to look at what's called the first order of difference. The first order of difference is a very simple concept. It simply means how many lines change as you go from one hexagram to the next. Simple, right? Okay, so as you go from hexagram 1 to 2, there's a certain change value, 6 or whatever it is, and then 3 to 4, 4 to 5, so forth, and so on. And so I found out what these data points were, and then I drew a graph of these values down to 64. And it's just a symbol of it, obviously. And so I looked at this thing for a long time, and it didn't seem to have any, it looked stochastic, random. It didn't seem to have any particular order to it. But then I noticed a very interesting thing, which is that this section is a mirror image of this section, such that imagine making a copy of this and putting it right here, and then rotating it 180 degrees in the plane, meaning turn it upside down to the non-technical folks. Turn it upside down, well, then it will slide into itself. A perfect fit here and here. So then you get something which looks like this. In other words, it has closure at the beginning and closure at the end, but no closure in between. Interesting thing about these data points is that if you think about the possible data points, they are obviously 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6, the number of lines that can change as you go from one hexagram to another. In fact, there are no 5s. If you look at the King Wen sequence, one of the first things you notice is that it is not simply 64 hexagrams. It is really 32 pairs of hexagrams, because each pair, the pairs are formed by turning the first term upside down. Now, there are 8 cases where turning a hexagram upside down has no effect on it. And in all 8 cases, it is followed by a hexagram which is exactly its opposite. And so the rule obviously is, if turning a hexagram upside down causes no change, all lines change. Then you can analyze these data points, and you discover that there are 75% odd values, 25% even values, exactly. So no 5s. This 3-to-1 ratio of odd to even and this peculiar closure seem to me sufficient argument that this is the product of human intent. This was supposed to be done this way. And in fact, in some of the older commentary on the I Ching, there's a passage in which it says the forward-running numbers refer to the past. The backward-running numbers refer to the future. Well, now in the I Ching, there are no backward-running numbers. But in this thing, there are. Because when you make this, you have 1, 2, 3 to 64. But what you've got over here is 63, 62, 61, down to 1. And what you've got over here is equals 64, 64, 64. It always sums to 64. So what this is some kind of magical, occult, multi-leveled, mana-laden thing that these pre-Joe diviners dreamed up. Essentially, the entire I Ching has been turned into this monoglyph of itself. Well, so now let's symbolize this thing by the letter S. A hexagram, as you know, is made of 6 lines. It's also, if you know a little more about it, in the commentaries, it's always thought of as being formed of 2 trigrams, 2 3-line structures. And then it has an essential and very powerful cohesive unity as a hexagram, as a unity, as a one. So every hexagram has 6 lines, 2 trigrams, and 1 wholeness to it. So the thought which occurred to me under the strong prompting of the Logos was to take this thing which I just showed you, which is at the top of a kind of hierarchy, and move it to the bottom of the hierarchy. And I did it and build a hexagram. So remember how I said we'll symbolize that thing by the letter S? So I took 6 of those, and I did this. Yeah, 6. I laid 6 in a row. And that stood in my mind for the 6 lines of a hexagram. But over this, I lay then 2. Like that. Those are the trigrams. And then I'm sure you anticipate my thought. Over that, I lay 1. That stands for the unity of the hexagram. Okay, so now what I had was a lot of lines running everywhere, and the absolute conviction that I now possessed an enormous secret of some sort, the map of time, the picture of history, the snapshot of the zeitgeist moving through a higher dimension, something like that. And I was a burden to my friends and a joy to my enemies for many, many months as I attempted to corner people in all-night conversations of great energy and perplexity that had my friends meeting to plan what is to be done. Hope this never happens to you. And finally, Ralph Abraham, God love him, said, it's an occult thing. I mean, it's just this occult thing. Only you understand it. And it's not even clear that your interpretation is always the same. He said, what you have to do is you have to turn it into an ordinary mathematical object that is, you know, a known quantity. Well, essentially, this was like telling your dog to split the atom. It was like, great, Ralph. Thanks. Do you think you'll have any time in the next few months to put in on this? And so I sat with it for a couple of years. And then one afternoon I was getting loaded and watching dust motes in a sunbeam and not thinking about anything much at all. And I had it. I had it, whole and entire. I saw how to take this occult thing, how to take its multiple properties, such as degree of parallelism, skew, overlap, the scales of the 3 levels, and all of these variables, and I saw how to collapse it into an ordinary mathematical object. And it's quite trivial. I won't bore you with it. It's so trivial. It basically has to do with deconstructing the wave, assigning numerical values to all of its parts, rebuilding it, and then adding them up. And then, lo and behold, all these intuitions you had about how when it is parallel and close together, values should drop and all that, are conserved, and we get the time wave. And the time wave and the computer is simply doing a whole lot of housekeeping work with it and not making any arithmetical errors and scaling it to time. Now, the objection that could be made to this, or easily could be made to it, and that I at one time felt the force of this objection. I've talked myself out of it now, but it's how I would have attacked it myself at a certain point. And it went something like this. Now let's see. You are advocating a revision in physics based on a Chinese oracle that you have deciphered a secret message from? Is that it? And how long have you had this particular delusion? So I've built a metaphor, which I hope makes it a little clearer why I believe it is reasonable to use a Chinese oracle as a stepping stone to a revision of physics. And in order to explain this, I have to have resort to a fairly elaborate metaphor. So here it is. Think of sand dunes. Just picture them in your mind for a moment. Now, notice that this picture in your mind of these dunes, that the dunes look like wind. They look like wind. Now, sand dunes are made by wind. What's going on here? The wind is a variation in pressure gradients over time, which moves the sand around. And when the wind stops blowing, what is left is essentially a lower dimensional signature of this higher dimensional phenomenon. Comme ci, comme ça? Now, for grains of sand, substitute genes. For wind, substitute millions of years of evolutionary time. Time flows, and the genes move around, and they assume certain configurations. I maintain that those configurations are lower dimensional slices of the higher dimensional architecture of time itself. In other words, we bear the thumbprint of the medium in which we arose. We bear it in every cell of our bodies. Every atom bears it. Every molecule bears it. And this, if this can be known, this pattern of time that is impressed in all organism and perhaps all matter, then time, an understanding of time unfolds as a fractal, an infinitely self-similar structure that is repeating different patterns on many, many scales in order to create the phenomenology of the universe as we experience it. So, that's basically the theory. And then the theory, I don't think, would amount to much if it weren't for the fact that with the computer, we can now take the theory and ask the question, okay, given all this arm waving and theorizing, does the unfolding wave actually mirror and hence predict the unfolding of the historical continuum? I maintain that at this stage, it's arguable that it does. Now, there's a curious and unsettling aspect to all of this. If you have a theory of wave mechanics of any system, waves have wavelength. Therefore, the wave must be generated from some point. And if what we're talking about is a graphic congruence between theory and nature, then theory must be fitted to nature in the search for a best fit between the curve, the describing curve, and the phenomena it seeks to describe. You understand what I mean? Now, the problem is, with this theory, if it is a problem, is that when we compute our best fit of the curve to the data, we reach a fairly unexpected conclusion, which is that novelty is going to reach infinity within our own lifetimes. That the universal process that has been going on for billions of years across this epigenetic landscape, wandering deeper and deeper into realms of novelty, faster and faster and deeper, is actually going to become mathematically outside of our description within our own lifetime, specifically in 2012 AD. It's not pleasing, this prophecy of the end of the world within one's own lifetime. This is the typical pattern of delusional messianism that is so drearily familiar. Nevertheless, we have more than a Lullian decoding of Scripture here. We have a formal and completely unambiguous algorithm, and we have a body of data. So I just will now demonstrate it to you, and you can reach your own conclusions. There are people who may not even be aware of this theory, who have reached the same conclusion. Some by avenues I respect, and some by avenues I don't respect. And without saying who's who, I'll list some of these approaches. There's a group of people, I believe they're called extopians or singularists. They're engineers. They're total rationalists. They're tech heads. And they say that the rate of energy release, information storage, and technological advance is proceeding so rapidly that sometime between 2010 and 2025, the whole system becomes unrecognizable to itself. Congruence with this prediction. The Maya civilization, which perished a millennia ago, had a 5,600 plus year calendar that culminates on the exact same day that this theory computes to, a fact which I didn't know when I made my choice for the end date. There are Hasidic Jews in Israel who believe that they have Kabbalistic logic to support the conclusion that the Messiah will appear in late July of 2012. And then someone mentioned last night this Vedic.
It's called Jyotish. It's spelled J-O-Y.
A form of astrology, right?
It's Vedic astrology, 3,000 or 4,000 years old.
So, whether you do it whether you calculate toward it mathematically or intuitionally or whatever, and whether you exist now or in the case of the Maya a millennia ago, certain people, by certain techniques, seem to have located a peculiar moment in time. And what exactly this means, we don't know, but this wave scales to it as well. Now, what I want to do here, this is this year, and pointing at today, and as you see, it will culminate here. But what I want to do now is put a lot of time on the screen and show you how this thing works. So let me specify time span, E. Okay, well, now, here, what we're looking at here is a very large span of time, 6 billion years. And the entire career of life on Earth is 600 million years, which is this downsweep. So you see, at that scale, it's like a done deal. It's almost a smooth curve. On a scale of 600 million years, it's just been an uninterrupted rush toward the omega point ever since we dropped gills and crawled out onto the land. As we magnify and zoom into this, it turns out there was a lot of drama along the way. Let me see if I can get my zoom going here. Now, each time it makes a new graph, we'll see twice as much detail and half as much time. There's 1.5 billion years. There's the last 750 million years. 375 million years. That's all life, getting hold of the planet. There's the last 100 million years. Here, let me stop that one. Okay, that's the last 93 million years. And there is a event that has to be predicted correctly for the theory to work. At 65 million years, there was an asteroid impact that caused the extinction of the dinosaurs. And there it is. It's an exact science, folks, but I'm not. Okay. Here is this extinction event. You've got 113 million years on the screen, ending at the 0 point in 2012, and this massive extinction event, 65 million years, clearly shows as the most dramatic event on the screen. Yeah.
So what is the opposite of the descent into novelty as you see the increasing point of scale reaching maximum at a slightly earlier time period? What's the converse?
Equilibrium. Yes, and then homeostasis.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, homeostasis is the perfect example because homeostasis is repetition, closed energy cycle.
Absence of chaos.
Absence of chaos. Predictability, in other words. And then it inevitably reaches a place where there's a symmetry break and then a cascade.
And then disintegration.
Okay, so now let's start our zoom forward again. Well, what you do is there's 46 million years. Let's get down here to something palpable. 11 million years.
What did you use to
This is primate territory.
What did you use to hit the asteroid date?
Just published material in Nature. There's the last 2 million years, like that. The question was?
How do you know when to start?
You mean how did I choose the end date?
Or the beginning date of the whole?
Well, the beginning date I'm a little fuzzy on. I simply propagated it back until I had more time than astrophysics requires for the life of the universe. And that was all I needed. I'm not entirely committed to the Big Bang. There's plenty of odd assumptions in all of that stuff. What I did was I thought about, at first I tried to scale it to the stuff I knew. So I've been sort of interested in history. So I said, okay, if you have a theory of novelty of history, where are the novel points in history without getting too technical? Well, I think anybody who's studied history 25 minutes would nominate the Greek Golden Age, the Italian Renaissance, and the 20th century. Or at least they would tolerate those candidates. So I said, well, let's see if we can find a place where 3 big troughs do that, and then let's look at the crucifixion, or something else, in other words, to see if it also appears to be correctly described. Well, eventually you get a fit where you can go from the Big Bang down to Nixon's resignation and always have this very satisfying feeling that it's giving it the correct scoring at the correct level of novelty and the correct ratio and proportion to the events in which it is embedded. And when I got it right, the the last 67-year cycle begins the day the atom bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. And it's a resonance, you see, with the Big Bang. And then everything else seemed to fall into place at that point. Now, it's tricky. It is tricky because it's a fractal. And so there are possibilities of error, but and that's why periods of time like what we're living through are so interesting, because you see, I've made the small-scale prediction that this period we're living in will be novel based on large-scale correlations. Now, if the prediction comes true, that clinches it. It shows then that the choice was correct, and we gain confidence. And I maintain there's, in principle, no reason why this much information shouldn't be known about the future. The future is not magically guarded from understanding any more than any other part of nature is. And in fact, statistics, probability theory, is a valiant effort to come to terms with the future. I maintain horribly and inevitably flawed by the assumption of linear time. What do I mean by that? Well, here's how probability theory works. Say you want to know, well, let me think of something, the charge on a certain, how much electricity is running through a wire. You want to know this. Well, here's how you do it in ordinary science these days. You measure the electricity 10,000 times, you add it together, and you divide by 10,000. Now, it's conceivable that the value you come up with will not match a single one of your measurements. Your measurements never agreed with this value. So what we're doing, you see, is because we assume time is uniform, we don't feel any intellectual sin in smearing those values that way.
Filter the novelty.
The law of averages damps the novelty in the system, and you get a kind of averaging. Probability theory cannot be done anymore with impunity if this is true.
Chucking the whole sort of fun of physics to the last 50 years, and I think you're throwing the baby out with the bathwater.
You mean to attack probability theory?
No, to ignore the excitement and the thrill of totally insanity that comes from quantum mechanics and relativity.
Well, no, I'm not rejecting that. The quanta is far larger than probability theory. I think, there's an interesting revolution going on in quantum physics right now. It amuses me. Arguably, the one concept that seems secure in 20th century physics, and about which there has been more ballyhoo and self-congratulations than about any other single concept, is the much vaunted uncertainty principle of Heisenberg, which is supposed to be a bridge to understanding consciousness, uniting science and art, letting us see the scintillating, elusive, mercurial beauty of the... It turns out it's BS, to put it as kindly as possible. When the Bohr-Heisenberg theory was formulated, there was another theory of the quanta on the table. But this theory had an assumption built into it which was thought to be so fantastic that it was never seriously considered, and instead this uncertainty principle was taken on board. The notion which was built into the rejected version of the quanta was called non-locality. And it held that somehow all particles that had ever been in interaction with each other in the past were somehow mysteriously and instantaneously linked to each other throughout all space and time instantaneously. And since all particles were once confined in a space less than the diameter of the nucleus of a Joe atom, then presumably all particles in the universe were connected together through this non-locality, if you accepted this B theory of the quanta. So it was rejected out of hand. This was a theory formulated by David Bohm. Well, now it comes back to haunt them because there is non-locality. It's been confirmed. At first, it was only there were thought experiments with it. Yes, and so here, but now experiments are being done where you actually bring two electrons together, separate them in space, flip the spin of one, and see the other one flip its spin, even though they're now separated in time and space. So the physics community, and let me say about the Bohm theory and the Bohr-Heisenberg formulation, the mathematics is identical. The mathematics is identical. One does not give better results than the other, but they have these completely antithetical concepts built into them, and I doubt that the Heisenberg thing will survive. It was actually a mistake. Oh, and that what I want to say then about the Bohm formulation is with Bohm's mathematics, velocity and location can be known simultaneously to any limit of exactitude. There is no uncertainty in the Bohr, in the Bohm formulation. I don't know how I got off on this. Yeah.
My proposal to you is that those guys are having the same kind of fun and are not into Darwinian events, that I think you'd feel very warm and close to them, because that is analogous to the one you're looking at.
Yeah, I would assume that if I'm right and if they're right, we'll have to meet somewhere out there. There's this guy Lentz at Stanford who has a very interesting cosmology, which he calls a fractal foam cosmology. And I don't understand his mathematics, but he talks about how in his cosmology, in the first few moments of the universe, these things were generated which he calls scalar waves. And they're waves, but they don't move. They're, as he puts it, frozen in space-time. But the reason you know they're there is because they affect the clustering and the ebb and flow of probability. That's it. That's it. I mean, it's absolutely it. So what Lentz's scalar waves have to do with the time wave, I don't know, but it's very, very interesting that these kinds of theories now are coming forward. I think it's because we are feeling an inadequacy in our science because the fine structure of complex systems won't come into focus using statistical analysis. You get a blurred picture of what's going on, and no matter how you deal with the data, it remains blurred because this temporal variable is in there that you're not aware of, and it's creating this inadequacy in your model. You wanted to say something?
Well, two questions. First, how do you introduce data into the system? In other words, given the I Ching as the construct, right, and a formula derived from that, which is the assumption I'm making here, what do you enter to create the graph?
You enter the valuations of there are 384 points in this thing because it's 6 times 64. So, and at each one of these positions, you generate a number, and then that is fractalized and put through this. And this is all explained exhaustively in The Invisible Landscape, and in the manual for this thing is now 75 pages long. And
the second question is, taking a 500-year model or a 250-year model or whatever we would choose in current time, is there a replication of the pattern currently shown with a decline of that order being demonstrated at any other point in history?
Yes, the question you're asking is, are there resonances inside the system? And of course there are, because it's fractal. So self-similarity occurs at many scales. As you see with a normal fractal, self-similarity is hierarchical. This has hierarchical self-similarity, but it also has a degree of internal self-similarity on every level. So this plunge that we're going through right now, its resonance, its direct historical resonance on the preceding larger scale is the period around the 10th century, 948 AD. Now, what happened in that period is there was an enormous cultural efflorescence in Islam. The Umayyad Caliphate at Cordoba and the other Umayyad Caliphate at Baghdad were producing, and a lot of it was mathematical and technical. It's arguable that that was the birth of modern science. Those kinds of resonances can be used as a basis for prediction, is something I haven't had time to look at. There are many resonances to each point. It's not a simple system. We can only discuss it in simple terms, but in the MS-DOS version, it will print a page full of resonances. And let me explain how I imagine time in this thing. Here's, first of all, how the Newtonians imagine time. If you ask a Newtonian, what is the most important moment impinging on this one? In other words, what moment is most important in shaping this moment? He will tell you, or she will tell you, it's the moment immediately before. This is this amazing faith in the momentum of cause and effect. This takes a completely different view and says any given moment in time is a kind of interference pattern caused by the existence of other moments in time. And that time is, in fact, an extremely complex, data-heavy kind of holographic matrix. And if you can decondition yourself from your large-scale position in things, you can actually feel or sense the continuum. I mean, I got it down to an aphorism. Rome falls 9 times an hour. And if you're paying attention, you'll feel it go by every time. And if you are cleaning your apartment or walking in the woods, if you notice, you think things that there is no rationale for. And as hemlines rise and fall on a slightly different scale, and as art movements come and go on a slightly different scale, what is all this? Well, it's other times, other resonances. It was very interesting. At the website a couple of months ago, I said that I looked at the wave and I said the end of the year would have a medieval flavor, because we were crossing through the late 8th century or something. And then I noticed, the liberals have this thing every Christmas time, this in Hilton Head, North Carolina, called the Renaissance Gathering, and Clinton always goes. So all the right-wingers got together at this thing called the Dark Ages as a satire on the Renaissance, and their Dark Age gathering occurred right in the darkest of the Dark Ages in the resonance. A lot of this is for the production of humor, I hope you realize. If you're fans of James Joyce and understand how Ulysses is constructed, what's going on in Ulysses is A man is trying to buy some kidneys to take back to his apartment to fry for breakfast. But somehow, in visiting the butcher and the local bar and running into an old friend, the entire Homeric war is fought out in these few blocks of Dublin, and also the entire fall and redemption of mankind. And this is called allegory, and it's nested reference and fractal association, and it's a very powerful way to make art. And I think it's a very powerful way to make art because it's how nature made the world. The world is an allegory, and it's based on analogies. I mean, I look sometimes at people, and I see other people, you know. I see faces from the past, sometimes my past, sometimes further back. Time is an interference pattern. Yeah.
The one thing I'm a little confused about is how you draw the pattern to a given scale. Like, does it make sense to say you could put in Terence McKenna's birthday and see his timeline?
People always ask this question. Yeah, although I'm not entirely comfortable with it. Let me trace the history of this kind of thinking for you. Astrology obviously has certain analogs to this because it's about predicting the fates of dynasties and so forth from the movement of the stars, and it's a peculiar combination of mathematical exactitude and occult fancy. Oh God, I've lost the thread. Ask again. The birthday thing, yes. So originally, astrology was a tool for statecraft. Royal houses and wars and stuff were fought and that kind of thing. Well, the first, I don't know if they were the first, but the first large crop of yuppies was late Roman. And these people had vast wealth, and they dabbled in the occult, and they were interested in these mystery religions, and they were aware of astrology as a tool of statecraft. And people asked the very same question. Said, you know, I'm an important person. Can you do a horoscope for me? And so then the natal horoscope was invented around that time, 1st century A.D., the natal horoscope. I can imagine that we each have our own time wave, in a sense, and that it begins at your birth and it ends at your death, or your death is a very novel point in the wave. The wave has different cycles in it. This has 384 data points. I mentioned that. Notice that 384 is exactly 13 lunations. At first, I thought I was discovering a Neolithic Chinese calendar, that it's an extraordinarily accurate lunar count. It precesses 19 days per year against the sun, but that might be a price people would be willing to pay, especially if it had been developed in a tropical climate. But each larger cycle is made by multiplying that number, 384, by 64. And each smaller cycle is made by taking that number and dividing it by 64. And what you get then over about 20 levels, stretching from 72 billion years at the top down to 6.55 times 10 to the minus 23rd at the bottom. In other words, the domain of Planck's constant, the realm of the jiffy. You get this set of nested cycles. Well, the next cycle up from this, from the 384-day cycle, is 67 years, 104.25 days. It's 6 sunspot cycles of the minor type, 2 of the major type, but interestingly close to the average human lifespan, 67 years, almost as though it's a kind of a tone, an octave of existence. I'm very interested in people's 68th year of life. what that feels like. Because in a sense, if you live to be 68 in this theory, you get to start over. You know, you were sort of, your slate is cleaned, and you get to go forward. But this kind of thing, I find, you know, I'm not that attracted to it. I'm more interested in the idea that this is some kind of a message from somewhere, and that the message is in two parts. The first part is, something extraordinary is going to happen to you and your world in 2012. And the second part is, and the reason you should believe the first part is because this wave which predicts that predicts all things which preceded it, predicted the Italian Renaissance, so forth and so on. Let me start this puppy going again, and I'll show you what I mean. What have we got? 1,000,000.4 on the screen.
What's the locality of it? Does this apply to our galaxy, the whole universe, or this planet?
Well, that's another good question. I've thought about it on all different ways, and I think it's local. I'm not sure how local.
So it has to be a King Wen and another planet to come up with the pattern that you used.
Well, if it's a universal fractal pattern, then it must be available in many places. A thing that would be very satisfying to me would be if somebody could find this same set of numbers somewhere else in nature.
Like
Bernoulli, anywhere.
What's the pattern
Yeah, I can't. The Fibonacci series.
Yeah. The Fibonacci can be brought out from simple rules into a complex set of data.
It sounds like that any moment in time can be decomposed into a number of hexagrams, and with the hexagrams have dignitary components to them, and that a hexagram has a meaning.
A little louder,
So you can draw from it. Is there a sense in which you can figure out what hexagrams correspond with what moment, and figure out the characteristics of that moment that way?
Yes, you can, and you could build a vast interpretive industry on that. In other words, there would be a way to extract meaning rather than mathematics from this. What you would do is you would look at a given point in the wave and not only look at its wave structure, but say what hexagrams are building this and what are the ratios of the influences that they're contributing. And that is basically, that's another lifetime of work for me, but that would be very, very rich stuff. Okay, let's go. Let it run for a minute. That's 1.4 billion years, 730,000 years, 366,000 years, 183,000 years. Now, those are glaciations in there. That's the last 100,000, 45,000. Now, let's look at this. This is the last. This is basically 5,000 BC. Now the stakes rise, because we know with fairly high detail what has gone on in the last 5,000 years in terms of inventions, cultural migrations, dynasties, so forth and so on. So this is from 5,000 BC to the present. Well, along this descent into novelty here are the great ancient civilizations. Ur, Chaldea, Babylon, and down here in the bottom of the novelty trough, pre-dynastic Egypt, Old Kingdom Egypt. In other words, the great pyramids are built precisely at the most novel point of that trough, which sort of supports the theosophical faith that Egypt did learn something, that it took a long time to go past them. Not necessarily 1950. According to the time wave, they were the most novel thing that had ever come down the pike until roughly the foundation of the Roman Republic. And that's about right. That feels about right. On this upslope, this is all pretty ugly stuff here. The Hittites, the Mitanni, Assyria. We're really getting into male dominance, warfare as a way of life, empire building, slavery, huge building projects based on human agony, ugly business. But it's punctuated by some real moments of progress, like, the Phoenician alphabet and so forth and so on. And up here at the top of this thing, Homer sings his song. The Trojan Wars occur actually just slightly before that. What's happening there is that Mycenaean piracy is overwhelming the old Minoan Empire. This is just in a small part of the world, but it happens to have a lot of consequences. Let me say about that, some people say your theory is so Eurocentric. Have you noticed what kind of world you're living in? That's right. That's why the theory is Eurocentric. In other words, the Maya may have been wonderful, but what counts in the historical game is how much influence you have on the present. And the Maya have no influence on the present. I mean, other than some interesting shards in the museums and a respect for their architecture, they didn't pass it on. So, there isn't a man, woman, and child on this earth who wasn't deeply affected by what went on in Greece in the 5th century BC. Not a man, woman, or child on this planet. Now, what was going on in 5th century BC somewhere else, that river of influence may not have reached the present. Some did, some didn't. But something got loose at the eastern end of the Mediterranean, right in this time span. I think it's the phonetic alphabet. I think the phonetic alphabet empowers a distancing from the object of your concern that allows this eerie Faustian thing that is so typical of the Western mind. And I didn't originate that idea. Many people have commented that the Greek alphabet, it just carries you so far into abstraction that then that thought style becomes inevitable. Yeah.
Now, obviously, you've been describing events in Western culture. What are the correlatives to Indo-Asian?
Yes, good question. In spite of the objection that the thing is culturally skewed toward European history, if you actually study world history, it's interesting. Great advances seem to occur simultaneously in different places. In and of itself, an argument for something like the time wave. So, while the Roman Empire is rising and establishing law and order and so forth and so on, the Han Dynasty is doing the same thing in China. As the Maya are reaching their cultural apex with their astronomy and their mathematics and so city building and so forth and so on, the Cordovan caliphates are doing the same thing. There's quite a bit of that sort of thing.
Is there any antithesis here at all measurable? I mean, a contradiction?
I don't understand.
Well, in other words, where one series of events would describe homostasis, another series of events would describe a descent into novelty. In other words, have you located any contradiction within the prescribed system?
No, because a descent into novelty, as it were, takes precedence. Equilibrium only counts if it completely pervades the system. You see what I mean? All right, let's go forward into this because I want you to see these later epochs. Oh, I guess I didn't enter the thing. I want you to see these later epochs because this is where we can really judge it more accurately. This is basically from 300 AD. AD, yes. This is from the fall of Rome to the present, not precisely. The fall of Rome it took a long time, and there were humiliation after humiliation. But generally, the kidnapping of Augustus Romulus in 375 is considered to be the final straw. So Notice that what this says is that after the fall of Rome here, history had a different character. It was not a steep and fairly uninterrupted descent into novelty, but it began to oscillate between periods of novelty and periods of intense recidivism. And notice also that this theory is not shy about making predictions. Now we're down on it. And this extraordinarily steep descent into novelty right here, that's the resonance to what's happening right now. That's 10th century Islam. This one which precedes it over here is the foundation moment of Islam. Muhammad is born in 570 and died in 630. That whole thing occurs along this descent. Islam is very important. I have to stress this because we all live in a culture that is totally anti-Islamic. And, you know, it's perfectly legitimate to talk about ragheads and this and that. But I've got news for you. You know, the science, the mathematics, the architecture, the poetry, the administrative skills, the knowledge of hydrology, so forth and so on. And for any people or person who is truly alarmed by modernity, we were talking about this evening, Islam is an answer. And I imagine it's going to experience great growth over the next few years. These portions of Central Asia that were held by the old Soviet Union, Kyrgyzia, Uzbekistan, Azerbaijan, Nagorno-Karabakh, and all of these places, if they were ruled by the people who live there, they would be radical Islamic republics. It's conceivable that in this period over the next few months, there could be a worldwide uprising of Islam that would end with it making the greatest territorial gains since it's made in the 10th century. If all Muslims were ruled by Muslim governments, an enormous reconstruction of the boundaries of the world would take place. So these two descents both seem related to Islam. I mean, Europe is just a mess at this time. I mean, Macrobius, writing in the 5th century, thought that the circumference of a circle was twice its diameter. You know, what? They didn't have string? I don't know. Imagine that. That's how low things sunk in Europe while these people were gazing at the stars and inventing the quadratic equation and so forth and so on. Okay, this one, hard for you to see, occurs in 1122. That's the crusade which breaks apart the stasis of medieval Europe and lets in all kinds of novelty, right? Now, the next one is this one, and this is an interesting one and illustrates how the character of descents, well, the different characters of kinds of descent into novelty. Let me get it on the screen a little bigger here. Here it is, this one. Now, it's a dramatic descent into novelty, but unlike most descents into novelty, it's also a dramatic return to normalcy. Now, what kind of event would give a signature like that? A dramatic descent into novelty, a dramatic ascent back to the previous
The fall of empire and the growth of another empire equals power.
Well, how about this? An epidemic disease. Yes, 1356. 1/3 of the population of Europe dies in 18 months. But now think about that. It's catastrophic. It's traumatic. But no new technology is introduced. No boundaries are shifted. No new religion enters the area. And no genes cross frontiers. There is simply a demographic collapse. Everything comes to a halt, and then everybody who was in number 2, 3, and 4 position moves up, the wheels start turning again, and there's no thirst for innovation. The entire effort is just to get back where you were before the bad news hit. And so, within a generation or two, you're back where you were. Very interesting that the correlation between what actually happened and the shape of the graph seems to support that conclusion. In contrast to that signature, notice what came next. An entirely different kind of descent into novelty. First of all, starting from greater recidivism and ending in greater novelty, such novelty that there is no recovery. There's a slight recovery, but this entire trough represents a lower level of novelty than had really ever been probed before. So what is this? Well, right up here at the top, it's 1440. No, that's in 1455, 15 years later, but that plays a role in it. No, 1440 in Mainz near Frankfurt, Johannes Gutenberg prints the first book. And if you think the internet was something, this was a biggie for information technology, for sure. And as you mentioned, very shortly thereafter, the Ottoman Turks seize Constantinople, and Europe's access to the East is strangled. And it's a total crisis for European civilization. So what is done is these incipient capitalists pool their money, and they finance new techniques in shipbuilding and navigation. So this is all technical innovation and novelty. And they build ships, and they sail around Africa, and they reconnect to the East. Meanwhile, what's going on, and they get rich. That's what I meant to say. They get rich beyond their wildest dreams. These agricultural hill towns in northern Italy that had been dealing each other wine for centuries suddenly find themselves the center of the largest aggregation of capital ever gathered on the planet to that point. And they just pour money back toward their benefactors, not only the scientists that had created the technological revolution that allowed this, but into the arts and into their palaces and into the planning of their cities. And they create the Italian Renaissance. And everybody who is anybody is positioned along this descent, you know, beginning with the proto-Renaissance, the Fra Angelico and all of that, and then coming down through Donatello, Donatello, Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, Titian, Raphael, the whole bit, and the whole thing reaches culmination right down here at the bottom of the trough. They actually experience a kind of eschatonic event at the bottom of this novelty trough, which is they discover the other half of the planet. That's what they do 500 years ago, 1492, right down here. Well, that blew the door off its hinges. There has never been return to normality in a certain sense. That did it. This trough, what this trough pictures, is a period that ends in 1619. 1619 is the beginning of the 30 Years' War. This period across the bottom of this trough has been called by art historians who have no knowledge of this theory the age of the marvelous. This is the age of the great Hermetic flowering. This is the age of Shakespeare and the court, the Rudolphine court in Prague. This is the age of Arcamboldo and John Dee and Robert Flood and, that incredibly complex, psychedelic, manneristic mishmash that those late Renaissance people put together. But there's a certain ugliness in it. It's not an entirely flat trough of novelty. There is a recursion to old patterns, and I maintain what that is the beginning of the rape, subjugation, of the New World, and then the rise of gangster capitalism in that environment. Because, interestingly, Europe was somewhat strangled before the discovery of the New World. I mean, it required resource management and all that. I mean, if you've been to places like Portugal, and you say, you know, these people ruled half the planet, this rocky, scrubby, storm-battered little country, how did they do it? Well, obviously by expropriating other people's resources. That's how they did it.
So there was a period of normalcy where everybody was shipping, and it didn't change that much. There were just years of ship, go out, empty, come back full, go out, empty, come back full.
Well, except that all this information was pouring into Europe. It was like as though they had landed on alien planets. You know, Albrecht Dürer went to an exhibition of Toltec carving in Leiden, and his diary entries on this, I mean, for those people to gaze upon these artifacts, it was literally like science fiction to them, and plants and animals.
And they were the center of the world, and all they knew was that. So it was like adding another Earth to the equation for them.
Exactly. An incredibly exotic Earth. I mean, animals, plants, human beings, the largest river in the world, the highest waterfall in the world, and on and on and on. It just swam into their kin, literally like an alien planet. 1619, the party's over. In America, this is called the Protestant Reformation out of some delicacy. It's not the Protestant Reformation, for God's sake. It's the 30 Years' War. It's when everybody in Europe just went nuts and slaughtered each other for 30 years until 1648. And, you know, the Cromwellian thing happened in England, and it was a drag. It was wars of religion. That little clip that indicates a descent into novelty, I call Newton's notch. Newton was important enough that the entire, I mean, I'm teasing a little bit. There was other stuff going on, the foundation of the Royal Society and so forth and so on. But generally, this was a period of recovery from the age of the marvelous. And it's an era of powdered wigs and social mores, increasing class stratification, increasing assertion of the power of the Protestant churches in Northern Europe, and so forth and so on. And then up here, 1740, this is what's called the European Enlightenment. And a bunch of French people, Voltaire, Rousseau, philosophers, theoreticians of how human society should be run, produce these screeds, these theoretical texts, but wild men in the Americas take this up, and the conclusion of all the philosophizing that goes on up here is the American Revolution, which occurs on a downsweep into novelty, and I would argue was reasonably successful, followed by the French Revolution, precisely on an upswing. In other words, a movement back into habit. And for my money, the French Revolution ended catastrophically. I mean, it's every liberal's nightmare, you know? I mean, it was horrible. The good people turned to monsters, and then they couldn't keep hold of it in spite of that. So the French Revolution ends with the enthronement of the Emperor Louis Napoleon. Go figure. And then so forth. And as you see, the 20th century is down here at a much higher level of novelty, lower toward the 0 point. And the entirety of since the middle 19th century, which is just about right, I maintain. Since the middle 19th century, we've just been exploring totally new territory. You know, once you get Michael Faraday and Konrad Lorenz Baron Lobachevsky and Fitzhugh Ludlow and all this, in other words, non-Euclidean geometry, electromagnetic field theory, psychedelic drug use. It all begins to come together, and of course then arguably the most important moment in the 19th century, completely unrecognized at the time, now predicted by the wave, was 1837, when Charles Babbage assembled the difference engine and laid the basis for the cybernetic revolution. Let's look at modern times in a little more. He built this thing called the difference engine, the Babbage machine. It was a computer, and he knew what it was. He understood what was possible with it. He went to the British government. He offered it to them. He begged them to develop this, and it was just so beyond their imagining. But it had all the elements of a modern computer. It was not electric, of course. It was a mechanical computer. But all the principles were there, and in Babbage's writing, it's very clear he understood exactly what he had on his hands. Incredible. If you ever see a picture of Babbage, I mean, think about this. This guy lived in 1837. He looks like Flash Gordon. I mean, he has a haircut so in advance of his time. It's incredible. Now let's look at this. This is from 1888 over here. And what's interesting is, we mentioned, or it came up this afternoon, how you can use the calendar as a political flog when you have nothing else going. Well, that not only happened that not only will for sure happen in 2000, but it very definitely happened in 1900. There's something about it. They had the same feeling, actually, that we do now. The telephone had been invented in 1895, or, popularized. They began installing them. That was the internet of that time. It's still pretty amazing stuff. I mean, how you deliver sex over copper wire, I don't know, but they managed to do that. And powered flight was happening all over the world. People were working on it. And so this point up here is, I believe, January 3rd, 1900 or something like that. It's so on the money. And then this cascade into novelty. They were full of hope. They felt it within their grasp. The old world, the Edwardian world, was falling away. It's 1900. Radio is ahead. Relativity is 5 years in the future. Planck's constant is filling the physics journals, and in art, the pataphysics is happening, and there's this in Italy. Futurism is beginning. The first futurist tracts are being published. Well, then. The First World War, quantum physics, all of these things, it gets weirder. It begins to get weirder. It becomes more than simply an object of optimism. It becomes hideously complex and novel and strange and bizarre. And it reaches an apex in 1933. And I don't have to tell you. So then, across the bottom of this thing, World War II is fought. And World War II was like a rehearse for the apocalypse. I mean, wars now are not particularly about anything. That was a war which was about something. And it was utterly surreal for the people who experienced it to live through. I mean, it was about eugenics. It was about rocket bombs. It was about the power of radio to move millions of people. It was about propaganda. It was all kinds of things. And of course, it ended with kicking open the nuclear doorway. anybody who doesn't think World War II was a surreal extravaganza, I recommend Thomas Pynchon's novel Gravity's Rainbow, which is an incredible thing to read, an incredible work of literature, and you'll never see life again the same way. Okay, so then once that's all over and it reaches its apex in the destruction of the Axis powers and the use of the atom bomb on Japan and so forth, everybody has but one thought. Let's knock this off. Let's have some kids, crack a beer, have a barbecue. They even called it the return to normalcy. And there was all this uniform conformity culture, Norman Rockwell, American white culture, all racial, sexual, intellectual, and social aberrant phenomena was incredibly repressed. And there were some spills along the way, the JFK assassination, so forth and so on. And then it approaches the cusp, the symmetry break. And if you have an incredible memory, you may remember that a few minutes ago I said Homer sang his song here, one cycle back, one fractal scale up. So the analogy is, or the analogy to Homer singing his song and to the fall of Mycenae and all of that, the fall of Minoan culture to Mycenae, is the 1960s. The freak revolution, the Vietnam War, the age of LSD, the landing on the moon at this scale cannot be discerned from the top of that thing. That all comes together right there. 1968, 69, that's where the cultural symmetry break occurs, and then the final descent into novelty at that scale begins. And I submit to you that's a pretty good rendition of the myth of the culture that the media reinforces and that many of us carry. I mean, we do believe that was the turning point, that once rock and roll, LSD, sexual permissiveness and all this stuff was unleashed, we've then just been refining and experimenting with those themes ever since. The 70s were a descent into novelty. The 80s, these were fairly steady descents into novelty, but they didn't surpass the madness of the middle 40s until the early 80s, I guess. It's not at scale here. But, and then, with the Reagan era, we enter into a kind of different kind of time. This bizarre oscillation business where there are surges of habit and then collapses into novelty, and then reassertions of orthodoxy, and then collapses into novelty. And this is what we're experiencing now. Here, I'll go in on this.
But faster than we've seen previously. Like oscillations happen over 5 or 10 years instead of oscillations happen.
Or oscillations over months, yeah. There's now 89 years on the screen. Here are the 1960s. And now we're back to today. We're descending this thing. So basically what you're looking at is the 90s with the present year in the middle. And it shows that this is, by the way, predicted to be the most dramatic year in the decade. And that dramatic, whatever that drama is, it'll be in full play by June. Wise grab at Taiwan by the Chinese. Or it could be an AIDS cure. Or it could be an Ebola outbreak. I wouldn't look to the American presidential election for much excitement unless there's gunplay, which never rule it out in this country. We play rough. There could be a scientific breakthrough of some sort. this planet detection thing is obviously edging toward explosion, because there is a water-heavy, oxygen-rich world out there within 50 light years, and the technology to detect it is now 99% in place. And it's just a matter of, teasing it out of this hellaciously difficult data. But we're going to know. Recently the Hubble Space Telescope discovered the other 80% of the galaxies in the universe. So we now have, instead of 10 billion galaxies, in one press release we go to 50 billion galaxies. That means 5 times as much intelligence, 5 times as many civilizations, and that's page 42 news in the New York Times.
Projection just take.
No, it's funny. People say, "Well, what will happen after 2012?" Well, you haven't been listening. This theory doesn't say anything about what happens after 2012. This is a theory about what happens before 2012. That's why waiting till 2012 to use it will be rather self-defeating, because it won't work after 2012. Of course, if there is an after 2012, it will be wrong, in which case we will have the curious task on our hands, some of us, of figuring out why it seemed right for so long. Yes.
He became 67 years old.
Yes. I've never heard of anybody having an experience quite like this. I mean, it's hard for you probably to appreciate who I am, because I appear fully in command of this. But I am not interested particularly in the I Ching. I'm not a mathematician. Don't like predestiny it's just not my style, this whole thing. I'm a rationalist and somewhat cynical, left to my own devices, perhaps a little dark. This is an incredible argument for some kind of hope. It says there is an architecture to time. It says the wars, the rapes, the horrible revisions that go on are part of the pattern, and all will eventually find resolution in the final culmination. And then, the question which I would put to the mushroom or the logos or whoever it is, if this is not true, then what possible purpose could all this have served? I mean, what's it for? I don't mind the public disgrace of being wrong, but it'll humble me. But we didn't probably need to mobilize a mass movement to humble me. So what was it all for? And I confess, I don't know. I have ideas. I mean, any question like that, as long as I've been thinking on it, there will be answers. I mean, how about this? Suppose the unconscious is a kind of has a kind of regulatory function, and of hysteria, of mass hysteria, and that what this prophecy made by me, made by the Maya, made by these Vedic people, what it's for is to smear expectations about the millennium. So that instead of having it all focus on January 1, 2000, there'll be dissenters. There'll be people who say, well, it isn't January 1, 2000. Haven't you heard? It's 2012. And so then a huge number of people will put their faith on 2000. They'll be disappointed, and they'll go away and get lives. And then the people who didn't contribute to that hysteria will delay their hysteria till 2012, and then it will fail, and then they'll get lives. And then by this ruse, the unconscious mind will have helped the species cross over this calendrical speed bump without, mass hysteria, nuclear war, or religious pogrom. which might otherwise be a factor. I don't feel the power particularly of this idea, but it's the only one I've come up which answers the question, if this isn't true, what the hell is the point?
In Jung's work on the I Ching, does he touch on any cyclical historical reference?
No, this is surprisingly absent, although in the Wilhelm Baines translation there is something called the sequence. And it's old, it's Joe, and it's a kind of a poem which attempts to make a logical transition from each hexagram to the next in the King Wen sequence. There are curious statements in the I Ching which definitely support the idea that there must be big chunks missing. For example, hexagram 49 in the Wilhelm Baines translation is called revolution. So you turn to this expecting a dissertation on political reform of society, and and what it says is the shaman is a calendar maker. He orders the seasons and he sets things right. And it's a whole discussion about calendar making and as a way of creating political reform. Well, that's bizarre. Another interesting thing is hexagram 63 is after completion. Hexagram 64 is before completion. The logic of their order is reversed. Again, suggesting that reversing the order of things is somehow allowed. The middle hexagram, meaning the hexagram at the halfway point, if you believe that the sequence was designed as a structure, is number 32, is called duration. And the image is of a ridgepole. Well, obviously, the ridgepole is at the center, and the rafters move off of it. I can't remember which hexagram it is that says, "He who correctly understands the import of this sacrifice can hold the universe in the palm of his hand like a spinning marble." That's a very alchemical redaction. And so forth and so on. I mean, there are all kinds of textual clues to the fact, and of course this is coming through translation. It's very important to read many translations of the I Ching. The Wilhelm Baines is incredibly deep and poetic and wonderful and preferred by me because I grew up with it. But did you ever notice? It's not a translation of a Chinese book. It's a translation of a German book. It's the Carrie F. Baines translation of the German edition of the I Ching by Richard Wilhelm. There's recently been other translations of the I Ching, and they are, some bring one thing to it and some another. But I think we have been, for culturally biased reasons, as I said, incredibly naive about time. And this is the final thought that I'll leave you with this evening. Say this is true. How can it be true and not involve God's entry into history or the explosion of the sun or the coming of the Space Brothers or some other highly improbable and somewhat cheesy event? How can it fulfill itself and yet, not require willful suspension of disbelief? Well, one thought that's occurred to me, you touched on it, the wave doesn't seem to work after 2012, but I've noticed in analyzing all this history and stuff that what the wave, like people will always ask me, does it do the stock market? Only if the stock market moves hundreds of points. Otherwise, it's lost in the noise of everything else going on in the world. When I ask myself, what does this wave predict best? In other words, is it politics? Is it biological evolution? What is it that it really predicts well? The answer is technology. It seems to argue that technology and novelty are almost the same thing. And interesting that the DMT creatures are builders in light. And now we're on the verge through VRML of becoming builders in light. Well, if the wave describes technologies unfolding through time, and if the wave can't be propagated past 2012, then it must be because in 2012 a technology is invented which makes linear time and ends it. In other words, time travel. Time travel. Now, 10 years ago, only mad people talked about time travel. It was not a respectable subject. Recently, there have been articles in Physical Review letters, in Scientific American, in Nature. It's a very hot topic. There are many schemes for time travel. There are many notions about how time travel could be done. And actually, we should have been paying attention because Kurt Gödel in 1948 wrote a paper that advanced a scheme for time travel that was within the realm of possibility. Possibility. I'm not saying we're going to cobble one together tomorrow. I mean, in some of these schemes, you have to spin cylinders the size of the solar system and stuff like that. But any technology that can be imagined can be realized by somebody. Well, if time travel were invented in 2012, that would explain why there was no longer possible a Cartesian graphical linear description of time's unfolding, because at that point time becomes multivectored and can no longer be portrayed in this kind of a matrix. Now, and this is the last on this, but an objection to time travel is always the grandfather paradox, which seems to imply that if time travel is possible, it's only possible forward in time. Because if it were possible backward in time, you could come back and kill your own grandfather, and then you wouldn't exist. And so therefore nobody could kill him, and you get a logical paradox that is always trotted out to defeat time travel schemes. I have a different notion of how this works. Time travel is not what we think it is. If what we call time travel is an invention, which if ever invented, the moment the time machine was turned on, the rest of the history of the universe will happen instantly, because in order to avoid these temporal paradoxes, the entire system would have to undergo a kind of collapse. Here's an analogy which might make this clearer. If you release gas into a cylinder, the pressure equalizes on the walls of the cylinder. This is called Bernoulli's law. Well, so imagine that we suddenly become able to travel into the future. At first I imagined that what would happen is thousands and thousands of time machines would appear instantly, having traveled backward in time to witness the first flight forward into time. It would be as though you could fly your Piper Cub to Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, to that windy morning in 1905 when the brothers W pushed out the flyer and took off. But then I realized, this bears with it the implication of the grandfather paradox. So instead, I think what happens is the moment the first time machine is turned on, the most advanced state of evolution arrives instantly at the other side of the boundary. I call it the God whistle. A time machine is not really a time machine. It's a way of destroying the rest of the history of the universe. And so, in a sense, we're back to the big picture again. The invention of the time machine is a self-initiated annihilation of space and time.
This technological device explains why technology is critical in the history of the way.
Yes, absolutely. And interestingly enough, if you think they wouldn't risk this, I told you yesterday, nothing comes unannounced. There's a very interesting story about the first atom test at Trinity in 1945. Yes, they had equations in front of them which led some people on the advanced team to believe that when the device was detonated, the nitrogen in the atmosphere would ignite, and that the entire atmosphere of the planet would burn. And they figured it was a 1 in 10. And so they said, reasonable odds. Hitler's out there. I guess Hitler wasn't out there at that point, but those wily Japs were out there. So they said a 1 in 10 chance, and they threw the switch, and it turned out the chamber was empty. So we're here to tell the tale.
Much closer to where you want to be than...
Well, this reminds me of a wrinkle. Here's a possible scenario which makes use of this concept. There is a cosmological theory out there. It's not the top contender. It's mostly been developed by this guy Hans Alfvén, and it's called a vacuum fluctuation cosmology. Quantum physics allows these things called vacuum fluctuations. And what they are is particles literally appear out of nowhere. And this is allowed by quantum physics as long as parity is conserved. And what that means is that these particles must contact their antiparticle and annihilate themselves and restore the system to a net energy of 0. But there is this, brief moment during the vacuum fluctuation when matter comes into being ex nihilo. Now, the interesting thing about the quantum description of the vacuum fluctuation is that the mathematics set no theoretical upper limit for the size of the fluctuation. It simply says the larger the fluctuation, the rarer it is. So Hans Alfvén suggests we are in a vacuum fluctuation of 10 high 22 particles. And what that means is that somewhere in the larger metaverse, our antimatter twin exists. And for the laws of physics to keep the accounts balanced, parity will have to be conserved. And what that might mean is a higher dimensional collision with our lost twin. And this would not be a collision in three-dimensional space. You wouldn't see it coming. It would occur instantaneously throughout the entire space-time continuum. All particles would annihilate their antiparticles, and there is only one particle that has no antiparticle. The photon there is no antiphoton. So if the universe were a vacuum fluctuation of this type, at the moment of the reconservation of parity, all matter in this universe would disappear. 100% it would disappear. And what would be left is all the light in the universe. And a universe filled entirely with photons, we have no idea what that is. That might be the mind of God. That might be the omega of the eschaton. Consciousness, there was an article in Scientific American, of all places, 3 issues ago, suggesting that consciousness is a general quality of the universe like gravity, and light is implicated. So it's possible that now that's a large scale. You talk about abandoning the body, This is a cosmology where at a certain point in the life of the universe, all matter disappears. And that would certainly, for my money, fulfill the novelty theory.
In a way, all the fiber optic being laid leaves for a lot more light being pushed around than previously, in a way, or at least light in a much more complex pattern than just the sunshine on Earth.
Well, and the fact that we're beginning to build with light, that virtual realities are made of light. People don't understand, in virtual reality, the difference between a 10-story building and a 100-story building, 1-0. You enter the code where it says make it 10 stories high, you add 1-0, it now makes it 100 stories high. Cost, it's free, light is free. I mean, virtually free. The technologies it moves through aren't free. But, we have hidden helpers in the quantum realm. Those little electrons, they are numerous. They want to help. Horton hears a who, that sort of thing. Well, that's the basic lay of the land on this. One last thing I should say, in the interest of intellectual honesty, is not everybody loves the time wave, and some of the people who hate it are very bright. And if you're interested in, Bear Duke's discussions about this, check my website. There's a young British mathematician who thinks he can take it apart, and we've been going at it hammer and tongs, and we're going to lift the curtain on our discussion pretty soon. I would like inspection. I mean, I invite, and those of you who are professional or amateur mathematicians, people should check my work. I told you the first night, my method is shamanic, but my techniques are shamanic, but my method is scientific and rational. The truth can defend itself. If this can be broken on the wheel of logical analysis, then so be it. It does empower hope, but there's no percentage in false hope. I mean, the only true hope is in the maintenance of an open mind.